Okay.
Hello, this is Harvey A from the University of Northern Colorado, and we are delighted to be with you at the 5th Annual International Conference on Social Welfare, Interdisciplinary Approach. My colleague and co-presenter,
Rashida Banerjee from University of Northern Colorado. Hello.
So today our topic is the challenge and opportunity of ethical leadership. And I'd like to begin by talking a bit about some of the leadership foundations and ethical challenges. First of all, what do we mean by leadership? We need to recognize that leadership always takes place within a specific context, and it is based on a solid foundation of leadership principles. I'd like to describe the guiding principles for leadership that include integrity, authenticity, something bigger than oneself, and cause in the matter. Let me just tell you a little bit about what we mean by those four foundational concepts for leadership. First of all, what is leadership? When we talk about integrity, integrity means your word defined. When we talk about authenticity, the definition of authenticity is being consistent with who you hold yourself to be with others and also with yourself. The third foundation of leadership is being committed to something bigger than oneself. What we mean by that is developing a serene passion that is required to lead and develop other leaders. The final foundational concept of leadership is what we refer to as cause in the matter. When you are cause in the matter, you are taking a stand for yourself and for your life, and you're acting from that stand. So to review those four concepts again, integrity can be defined as what you said, what you know, and what is expected. What we mean by authenticity is recognizing when you are not being authentic. Being committed to something bigger than oneself is really the purpose for your career and your relationships in the social welfare professions. Finally, cause in the matter is being accountable, not being a victim. It is really the context that you give yourself. Now, it's important to have a good understanding of these concepts. Some of you may be thinking, isn't the golden rule a good idea for how we would act and behave as leaders in our profession? The golden rule, which is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And we would agree that a world in which everyone followed the golden rule would be wonderful. However, this leaves you with no power, and one is left depending on the goodwill of others to benefit personally. Being authentic is being and acting consistent with who you hold yourself out to be for others, including who you allow others to hold you to be, and as well as who you hold yourself to be for yourself. So while this sounds fairly obvious, it's much less obvious in how you get there. The path to authenticity is being authentic about the various authenticities that you may demonstrate. Being committed to something bigger than oneself, I already defined that as that source of serene passion. And the question to ask yourself around this concept is, are you committed to being bigger than the way you wound up being today? What is the purpose in your life, and what is the purpose of your career or your relationships? Finally, cause in the matter. This means everything in your life as a stand you take for yourself in life and acting from that strong stand. We contrast this with victims. Victims have no power, and if you are cause in the matter, you cannot be a victim. So keep in mind, cause in the matter is a context that I give to myself, and it's certainly not about the content of leadership. What emerges as a result of that is the being and action of leadership, sometimes referred to as ontological, phenomenological leadership. So moving ahead, we want to talk about some of the ethical challenges and opportunities within leadership. I wanted to touch on four major points in describing that. And think of it in terms of the leader's opportunity to either become a light that shows the way for other members of an organization, or as a shadow that provides an obstacle or a barrier for members to be successful within a social welfare agency. Those four concepts include power and privilege, secondly, deceit and inconsistency, third, misplaced or broken loyalties, and finally, irresponsibility. I'd like to comment just briefly on all four of those concepts. When we think about power and privilege in terms of ethical leadership behaviors and actions, we keep in mind that power in and of itself can have a very corrosive effect on individuals. It can be a cancer that causes an agency or an organization to struggle. And related to that, the greater the power, the greater the potential there is for abuse. We know there are different types of power: position power, power that's based on influence, power that's based on authority, referent power. The same concepts hold true regardless of how it is played out. So one of the specific behaviors that we look for in terms of how power is being used appropriately is, do you make friendly and reasonable requests of those people who you lead, or do you make demands or threats? Obviously, the friendly and reasonable request makes a lot more sense than demands or threats. Lastly, there is potential for corruption both by individuals who have too little power as well as by those who have too much power. Being starved for influence within your organization can lead to a dysfunctional and a challenging situation that provides additional obstacles to ethical leadership behavior. And we all know, and the examples are documented across the world in terms of those individuals who had too much power and abused that to the detriment of the people in their organizations. When we talk about deceit and inconsistency, as a leader, the primary guiding factor there is what kind of access do we all have to information, and are there any limits to transparency of that information? Some of the challenges that come out here when you think about how do we provide information to members of our team or our organization is, do we deny having knowledge that we possess? If we are doing that, is there a good reason for that? And more often than not, good leaders err on the side of transparency. The window is very wide open in providing that access. Secondly, do you ever find yourself withholding information that team members need? That's another demonstration of deceit and inconsistency, sometimes without even recognizing it. Another example would be using information for personal benefit. When you think about, it's almost like an insider trading concept in the stock market when you think about how that applies to human service organizations. Another concern is, do you violate the privacy rights of others in sharing information? Do you release information to the wrong people? The limits of confidentiality and privileged communications certainly need to be considered in this equation. And finally, and most importantly, do you prevent other team members from having access to the information? Are you not sharing information with others who have a legitimate right to know? Those are some guidelines to think about when we think about the ethics of leadership. Our third concept is misplaced or broken loyalties. Trust is a powerful concept, and it really supports effective organization. We know from the research literature that trust relies on openness and supportiveness, both being open to others and able to support others, and allowing others to be open to you, encouraging that openness, and allowing yourself to be supported as a leader. When trust is breached, you can hardly ever fully recover the same level of loyalty that existed prior to that broken loyalty. Leaders place the needs of the community as being very important, and the needs of the community need to be weighed against selfish interests. We all operate with a certain level of what do I get out of being in this organization and what benefits me? But the challenge is to put the needs of the community first. The biggest test of trust and to avoid those misplaced loyalties is to practice leadership where you always tell the microscopic truth. Telling the microscopic truth means you give the same information to your supervisors and your subordinates in the very same way. You don't pull any facts, you don't try and soften the blow of bad news or highlight good news. It all has to be told in the same microscopic approach. Finally, irresponsibility. Leaders are responsible for their own actions and, by extension, for the actions of team members. When we ignore or deny ethical problems, that's being irresponsible. When we hold others, particularly members for whom we are responsible as leaders, to a higher ethical standard than we are willing to follow, that's also irresponsible. So when we think about that, that provides a certain set of obstacles and challenges for leadership behavior. And Dr. Banerjee will talk about some of the numerous strategies that promote ethical leadership.
So now that we know what is leadership and what are the strategies or characteristics of leadership, let's look at some of the strategies to becoming an ethical leader, strategies that have been described in the literature. So the first one is ethics mindfulness. What do we mean by ethics mindfulness? It starts from John Dewey's notion that ethics is a matter of reflective conduct in which ethical thinking becomes a foundation for ethical action. Ethics mindfulness is a part of what psychologists refer to as individual self-identity, how we feel about ourselves, how we think about ourselves, and a moral self-identity that is an enduring and ever-present positive influence on behavior. A form of self-regulation that causes one to behave with an ethical consciousness from one decision of behavioral event to another. Most people look to their culture to determine what is ethically right and what is ethically wrong. And it could be an individual culture, or it could be the culture of the organization, it could be a family culture, broader at the macroscopic level. So what are the implications for leadership for ethics mindfulness? Bandura's classic work with social learning theory shows that self-regulation is highly responsive to learning from one's social context, meaning that we learn by watching others. What it means for leadership is walk the talk. Ethical leaders must become role models and display ethical mindfulness to activate self-regulation in others. And this is a quote I found, which is a proverb in Lithuanian language, which translated into English means, just as one calls into the forest, so it echoes back. So just as you do, it's reflected in what you see in the others. Leaders must reinforce ethics mindfulness by strengthening and communicating ethics values throughout an organization. What it means is that the focus is on changing the social context rather than the change in individuals. The next strategy described in the literature is succession planning. The implications for succession planning is you have to leaders develop a succession plan in terms of who is the next leader going to be for the organization that they're working for. Leaders provide training to those who are interested in this who are interested in succeeding the leader. Leaders provide specialized training on how to mentor, coach, develop peer skills. Emphasis should be on developing ethical individuals and an ethical organization. And evaluating and revising the training plan based on what the data you receive is an ongoing process. The additional do's and don'ts, implications for leaderships. One of the additional do's described or don'ts described in the literature is avoid bureaucracy. Educational leaders who rely primarily on hierarchy, rules, and standard operational procedures for the authority to effectively run their schools emphasize this bureaucratic frame, something that you want to avoid as a leader. Emphasize professional codes of behavior, formal professional codes of behavior rather than bureaucratic or personal sources of authority. Having a process in place, having policies in place to guide the work of a leader is important. Leaders gain ethical literacy related to leadership work. Understanding what ethical leadership is all about and what is the process for obtaining that ethical leadership is critical. Policy landscape is changing. Leaders must be prepared for changing roles of these educational institutions. Similarly, ethical leaders screen strategic vision or plan using an ethical lens and develop an ethical framework beyond a vision and a mission statement. Having an ethical framework that guides the day-to-day workings is important. Ethical leaders promote social justice to reduce social, political, economic, and educational inequities amongst the people they work with. Most importantly, perseverance is the key. Another idiom, proverb from Lithuanian language that I found, which basically means that many small changes will soon make a big difference. Rome was not built in a day. Do not give up. It's consistent, persevering effort that leads to ethical leadership. So what I want to talk about next is to see what does it really mean in action. There are certain organizations, they have provided guidelines to what ethical leadership can look like in an educational institutions. So for example, the Council for Exceptional Children, which is an international organization that guides the work of young children and families and professionals who work with these children and youth and families, they have 12 principles which are called Special Education Professional Ethical Principles and Practice Standards, and they can be available at this link provided in the slide. The next group that has ethical policy standards is Council of Chief Staff School Officers, Educational Leadership Policy Standards developed in 2008, and also the Council for the Advancement of Standards in Higher Education, which specifically leads to Statement of Shared Ethical Principles in Higher Education. Related to ethical leadership, there are certain international leadership initiatives in social welfare that I want to talk about briefly here. Some of you may be familiar with these efforts, some of them may be new to you. So the first one is the biggest historic Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities from United Nations. It was adopted on 13 December 2006 at the United Nations headquarters in New York and was opened for signatures on 30th March 2007. The convention entered into force on 3rd May 2008. The UNCRPD is the Human Rights Convention promulgated by United Nations, the first one in this century and the first legally enforceable instrument of the United Nations specifically directed towards persons with disabilities, and reputed to be the most rapidly negotiated treaty ever, with the highest number of opening signatures recorded by any human rights treaty. For more information, you can click on the link provided in this slide. Furthermore, the CRPD is a comprehensive and integrated convention. It sends a signal that the international community recognizes the place of disability within the human rights canon, and this was an important achievement for advocates in the disability field. However, CRPD is not about the enjoyment of any specific rights or about new rights entitlements or a mere guidance. It represents a binding international law on the government that ratify it and places obligations on states to reform, So it is a guidance with teeth. CRPD is the overall vision and detailed policy pertaining to the civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights of persons with disabilities. Some of the other international leadership initiatives in social welfare are the Salamanca Statement from UNESCO in 1994. It is a framework for action for special needs education. The documents represent a worldwide consensus on future directions for special needs education, and the website link can take you to the document. The Education for All initiative from UNESCO that has been supported by UNESCO and the World Bank is an international initiative first launched in Jomtien, Thailand in 1990 to bring the benefits of education to every citizen in every society. The international community reaffirmed this commitment in Dakar, Senegal in April 2000 and again in September of that year. The other initiative, Education for All initiative, has 6 specific goals that are highlighted here. The other initiative is the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. The 8 goals by the target date of 2015 must be achieved by the states who sign on to it. United Nations countries form a blueprint agreed by all the world's countries and all the world's leading developmental institutions. The 8 goals are to eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, to achieve universal primary education, to promote gender equity and empowering women, to reduce child mortality rates, to combat HIV/AIDS, malaria and other diseases, to ensure environmental sustainability, and to develop a global partnership for development. Of particular relevance for us, while all of these are important in bringing social justice and social welfare in countries, relevant is goal number 2, to achieve universal primary education, and related to that, gender equality in terms of education for adults. And then finally, the UN Declaration of the Rights of the Child. The UN Declaration, the United Nations Conventions on the Rights of the Child, is a human rights treaty which sets out the civil, political, economic, social, health, and cultural rights of children. The Convention defines a child as any human being under the age of 18, unless the age of majority is attained earlier under a state's own domestic legislation. And all countries under the United Nations, except 2, have signed this Convention on the Rights of the Child. And the link to more information is available in this slide. And now on to Dr. Root to wrap up our session.
So as you can see from Dr. Banerjee's overview of strategies, there is a significant wealth of approaches to address and promote ethical leadership across organizations, across cultures, across countries. We thought it was most appropriate to talk about this in terms of our experiences at the conference at Šiaulių University last year. We are just delighted to be joining you by distance this year and look forward to hearing from you in terms of questions or comments that you may have. But to wrap up, our guiding question is, why does it matter for social welfare? There are so many reasons why this is of critical importance. And we believe that ethical challenges or dilemmas are inherent in anyone's leadership role. If you are not confronted with these challenges, you are probably not doing the kind of vital and innovative leadership work that should be considered within your own responsibility. There's also a need to promote a positive impression of your organization. That is clearly one of the responsibilities that we all want to do for our organization. But we need to do that without compromising the integrity. We can't be misrepresenting what our organizations are doing or what they are accomplishing. We also recognize that no culture has a monopoly on truth, whether you're from India or an immigrant from Norway. We both believe that we can learn from one another, and just as we did last year as being a part of your conference, and hope to hear from you again this year. By combining the insights from different cultures, we create better solutions to ethical challenges and dilemma. And what we've shared with you today is simply that idea that Strong leadership, recognizing the obstacles and barriers to ethical approaches, the multitude of strategies that are out there to help you be successful, lead to the successful outcomes and results that you want to see. So I would just like to say thank you for the opportunity,
Thank you.
and we look forward to seeing you on another opportunity.